Thank you so much. Yeah, and as mentioned, I'm Yat, Chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the meaning of tokens, the impact on AI, and actually what it means for us as humans, how to think about that. And I want to first talk about tokens. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it today, but generally speaking, I think it's helpful to sort of talk about the lens that we take. So let me first talk about sort of, the asset type or the raw material that is so critical in the digital age, which is of course data, which we would classify as perhaps the world's most valuable resource today. Probably not a surprise to you, given everything that's happening with OpenAI and basically everything else that's happening in the digital space. The powerful thing about data, though, isn't the fact that data in itself is like a resource, kind of like oil or commodities, is actually the kind of resource that compounds on itself. So, meaning that it has infinite network effects. The more data you add onto more data, the more context, the more valuable it becomes. And that's basically why the platforms have become so powerful. And it's fueling all the things that we see today, of course, in AI. And of course, one of the other things that's happening in the space is that it's not just delivering context from external sources, it's also receiving this from sources that we ourselves create, whether we post stuff on Instagram or on TikTok or on social media or the health data that we have on our iPhone or all that kind of stuff. We actually become the product because we're basically the resource and we deliver information. And that information becomes knowledge, and that knowledge basically compounds on itself to create these incredibly powerful network effects. And these network effects don't belong to us, they belong to the platforms. And today, these platforms, as we like to call them, these Web2 companies, are actually the biggest companies in the world. Whether this is an Apple or Facebook or Google or an X or TikTok. And some of these valuations are a little off because some of them have actually literally had added like half a billion or in some cases $1 trillion on top of it. But the point is that it's that exclusive access of those network effects that make them so powerful. And essentially, the equity construct allows them to sort of generate profit from it, but we as an end user don't have a way of owning that. And so what's interesting, though, in Web3 is that, with the token economy, we actually have a way in which we have a representation of a digital ownership, which now we could actually own a piece of the network. Like, for instance, when you own Ethereum or you own Bitcoin or Solana or any one of these tokens, you actually have a way in which you have ownership basically in a piece of that network effect. And the network effect is, of course, financial in nature because it has a property right. In the same way that when you own a property, whether it's something like a Pokemon card or whether it's something like a sort of, piece of real estate, the fact that you own it essentially allows for a financial market to develop whether you like it or not. And then, of course, with the token, you can then also have the application use cases that are attached to it. So for the first time, we have a new kind of asset class in essentially the digital landscape that tokens become these forms of network assets. Now, when we say network assets, we called it a new kind of asset class because previously you weren't able to own a network effect. Like just think about when you buy Ethereum. You're not buying Ethereum because it gives you like 2% yield, right? That would be a pretty weak product in and of itself. Actually, you're buying it because you're a member of a network, and there's compounding network effects that come from that. And these network effects could be very short-lived, or they could be long-lived, or they could be very substantial, and they could be deepened. And the deeper those network effects, the more valuable those ecosystems become. Right? So in other words, if Instagram was a token or had a token, there would be a value that could possibly be so maybe a significantly large token relative to basically the network effect that is represented in Instagram outside of the equity construct. And that's basically what it means to have these incredible network effects in these network assets. And they extend the reach of these networks. Even when you think of something like a stable coin, which doesn't have a value increment because, of course, it's a stable coin, but actually the reach of the network is wider and larger because it is a stable coin. I mean, there's over 150, maybe even 200 million people around the world today in places like Africa and India and Pakistan who actually now have the ability to trade in US dollars and become dollarized, through the form of a token. So the network effect and the power of the dollar has now been extended and perhaps even become more powerful because of it, despite the fact that it's not more valuable because it's a dollar, but it's actually more powerful. And again, it's a form of extending of that network effects. And RWAs function in much the same way, in the same way that the internet created that kind of distribution. Now we have that kind of value distribution that's happening basically through blockchain. So you now have this construct where, in what we call in Web3 or in crypto, you can now own essentially, basically through the token, a kind of digital property right. And of course, you could say that Bitcoin was the OG of that, the first form of true digital property right that can be sovereignly owned by you. And of course, that blueprint has been sort of leveraged throughout. And it's also important to note, and this is basically how all networks work, whether it's web network effects work, whether it's Web 2 or Web 3, is that the value doesn't come from just one entity delivering value. It comes from value generated from each of the connections. And that's how value is formed, whether it's human or, I'll come to that later, AI agents, whether they trade or they do activity from each other, right? And today, when you think about how you got into the Ethereum ecosystem or the Bitcoin ecosystem, you didn't get into it because Satoshi Nakamoto told you to do so, or Vitalik told you to do so. Maybe some of us did, but you probably got in because your friend told you about it, or because you went to a DeFi protocol. You went something that was not related to the original creators of this, because essentially there were different network effects doing different things, helping grow the power of that network. And essentially, all small and large tokens basically build upon that, creating this new form of asset, which is a network asset. And so one way to think of this is that tokens basically become like digital commodities, because again, they're forms of property, and the kinds of property often are about signaling information and attention. And much like a commodity, their pricing tells us something about the market and essentially affects consumer behavior. So that means that, for instance, when you think something like the Trump token, we could say it's silly, it's bad, you may like it, you may not like it. But the fact that the Trump token had all this attention comes from the fact that there is a network effect embedded within a community that is priced from a financial perspective. So it's a little bit like an open poly market, right? In the same way that poly market specifically, you basically have, prediction markets about a particular event. Tokens essentially show you the attention of where something is when the token rises, because there's attention coming from the market for it as a form of, goodwill, or a form of product, or a form of success, much like a stock market or much like a commodity is, right? And this ranges from all sorts of tokens, whether it's altcoins, big tokens like Bitcoin, or even meme coins like Doge or, Chill Guy, for instance. And so one way to think about altcoins, and I'll get very quickly into how this really translates into AI, is the attention economy. And the attention economy is a very critical piece because it's essentially the prime economic driver of the digital slash Web 2 world today. And we would argue that altcoins are very much representative of this attention economy right now. So when you think about the history of Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3, the early days of the internet, we had these websites. Many of them cost millions of dollars to make. And really, they were sort of making money through advertising in the form of these sort of very primitive forms of essentially attention. But there was few of them. And then with Web 2, right, this website essentially extended into what I would argue is billions of websites, meaning that your experience in Instagram or TikTok or LinkedIn or Facebook, these are all just new forms of websites. So when you count how many websites you yourself have now, you don't have one or two, you have probably a dozen, if not more, because these might be your identity, but they're actually just a new form of a way in which you draw attention to yourself, whether it's through Instagram or through Facebook or through TikTok, right? And in Web3, this essentially through ownership extends itself from a tokenization standpoint, one where you can own it and where you can trade that attention. And that attention basically is, in the same way that we now have billions of websites, means that we're going to have billions of these different tokens. And in many cases, maybe the user doesn't even know they have a token, or the AI agent is trading on it on their behalf on the back. But before I get there, I just want to give you sort of, for those of you who are not familiar, what is the attention economy worth? And the attention economy is worth $1.1 trillion, which is significant. And essentially close to 80% is actually driven by digital attention, which is how Facebook, Google, Apple, all these guys essentially make money. And so that is a kind of property right. It's just a property that they own. And through tokenization, you can actually have a piece and stake in that and become the target and center of that advertising yourself. Meaning that when you think about the token space, right, it's not just about tokenizing real world assets or maybe intrinsic assets or, store values like Bitcoin. It's actually taking assets that are already there, whether it's intellectual property, whether it's art, or in this particular case, attention as in advertising, and tokenizing that as a way to basically derive value and grow basically where most of the revenue is coming from today in the digital world. And just to illustrate that example, we're early, right? But over the last four years, and this is actually higher now, close to $50 billion worth of airdrops have been given to users. Now, one way to think of it is to say these airdrops are kind of useless. They're kind of, just, free money. What does it all mean? But no, it's no different than spending, $1 trillion in advertising, which is you're actually spending money to bring attention to a product or a service or an application. How did you earn that airdrop? Because maybe you tried the protocol, or you tried the game, or you tried that activity. And actually that money flows into the system and, many cash out, because they don't care. In the same way that someone sees a bit of advertising, it's failed advertising, right? How many of you have watched an ad that was paid for and you just didn't bother? But the ads that you did do, you went in, you bought a product, you tried the service, you did that kind of stuff. No different. The difference only here is that instead of paying the platform through the protocol,
wasn't sure
if movement directly as a target. And they can target you because they know who you are, or they know what assets you have on-chain, which is the reason why we think on-chain is going to accelerate and grow. But now comes sort of the critical piece here, which is that as we move towards these airdrops and these tokenization platforms where you receive airdrops, we go from a world, which is like the Facebook and Instagram and so on, of company-owned platforms, into one which is community and AI powered, where essentially they are running these networks and they're the ones who are giving you tokens and giving you reward. And I'll get to that shortly. But I just want to sort of segue quickly into one topic before I then go into exactly what that means when we talk about community and AI powered platforms and what it means when they tokenize. The one other thing I wanted to highlight is also when you come to the digital economy, which is kind of quasi-tokenized, but again, owned by platforms through virtual currency and different assets, is gaming. Today there's about 3.4 billion gamers, which is roughly 60-something% of the world's internet. And most people might not realize that actually the largest number of AI activity, even if it's dumb, actually happens inside games, through the form of NPCs, or basically non-player characters, right? And because the sort of interaction is so inane and it's more like very, very basic, we don't think of it as AI, but it's basically old forms of AI. And eventually, as costs go down and as they are funded through these token economies, they're going to get smarter with LLMs and these kind of on-chain interactions. But we believe that a lot of that growth in AI will basically be powered through the gaming platforms, right? Because essentially, if you think about it, video games have already essentially created this simulation environment before we see essentially the simulations that we see happening in the LLMs simulating our languages and our thoughts in many ways, right? And gaming companies are amongst the ones that actually spend a lot in AI. Basically Take-Two, the creators of Grand Theft Auto, have many patents in this area. So of course, GTA 6, which is a big game, is probably going to be one of the areas of very interesting innovations in AI. But the reason why I wanted to highlight the gaming argument, outside of the fact that we're basically all engaged in it in a way, trading virtual currencies, which kind of tokenized in this AI world, is that actually the source of NVIDIA comes from games. And it isn't because people cared about GPUs. In fact, for those of you who might remember, Intel almost killed NVIDIA because from a productivity standpoint, you don't need a GPU to run Microsoft Office or to run an Excel spreadsheet. You needed a GPU to run games. And NVIDIA became this powerhouse originally through video gaming, which then offered a platform for basically things like Bitcoin mining, and eventually, actually fairly recently, if you think about it in the arc of history, for essentially AI compute in the way that it is today, becoming essentially the most valuable company in the world because of that. But it came from this whimsical activity of a purely digital native thing, which is to play video games. And to play video games better, I would essentially need these GPUs. And basically, the reason we have AI and the reason we have essentially this initial mining infrastructure actually came from video games as a root. Now let's talk about sort of blockchain and AI and then basically what it means for tokens. So I think the most obvious use case is, of course, this is an example of where sort of Getty Images basically sued Stability for copyright infringement. And this is, of course, an old example. But the reason that worked is because Getty Stability was kind of lazy. They just took all the images from Getty Images and didn't even bother to remove the watermark. So it was very clearly visible that it was essentially taken, and so they sued them for $1 billion. Not sure what happened to the lawsuit, but either way, there's a kind of fingerprint, even if it's visual, that you can see. But in most cases, we won't be able to see that fingerprint, and we're all creating data right now. Creating, as I had shared earlier, we're sort of feeding the engine, as it were. But that engine doesn't pay us. But actually, if you do fingerprints at scale, then you have a way in which you could lay a claim on the fact that, even if you don't get paid for it, at least you get credit. One of the things you can do with AI is cite your sources. It's actually interesting to see how they do this and how they, Perplexity would offer sources voluntarily, whereas ChatGPT does not. And eventually we get to a point where people might not even know what's real or not because they don't sign these sources. But the point being that this would be essentially the audit trail that's really important. But the relevant and perhaps more important thing we feel for AI is essentially the future of agentic AI. So we've been very focused most of the time about AI that, where we tell them what to do, right? You tell ChatGPT, or you tell You tell Perplexity, what you need, and they do something for you, right? And they take it.
It's not a very
But actually, what tokens do, because they're the native currency of an AI agent, is that they become truly agentic because they can start doing things for you. Right? And in this case, they start to not just trade or do activity; they can actually even become much more agentic as an independent. Because as I had shared with you earlier, as an example, when you basically are paying out $50 billion of basically tokens that were created from the protocols or from Web3 games or from meme coins, for instance, right? Then what's the difference between an AI agent that lives on the blockchain that essentially launches a token on something like Pump Fund, for instance, has some kind of mimetic value, creates value, and then pays you, the end user, for giving it some data or some activity? And do the users care? I mean, people are giving already sort of Uber ratings and whatever on the virtual platform of people they don't see, and people are already receiving airdrops and tokens and faucets from different token ecosystems without knowing who that person is. So what's the difference between you getting an airdrop from a protocol and you getting an airdrop and getting paid from an AI agent? There is no difference whatsoever. Right? And so we're getting to an era, and it's already happening, where essentially you are being paid by AI agents and humans are working for AI. In a relatively limited scope, relatively speaking, to the world, but you can see how that extends. For instance, if you're an AI agent, there's a great trader and you make profit and you want insights. You have the ability to source that insight, and that AI agent will become larger because it will pay a share of its profit to people who contributed data, for example, right? So you can see that type of stuff evolve even ever larger. And the key sort of point is that because essentially tokens become autonomous AI's default currency, not just because it's faster and cheaper. Also, it actually means for the very first time, AI agents actually have true power because they have the ability to make money or create money or value. And that means that they have real autonomy because that means they have something that we want, as opposed to we use them as a tool. We might get used by them, right? Which is kind of interesting. And we think this will also begin very much in video games because in a way, if you think about what we do in video games, we actually do what the AI agent tells us what to do. I mean, our children are playing video games and the NPC says, come collect this and do that. And actually, we're following the instruction of an AI that tells us what to do. Except here, it's for fun, you could say. And actually here, they would pay you money for that, right? So you're getting to an area where if you're not tokenized, for instance, you will be left out of the entire sort of scope of those millions of autonomous AI agents who would buy and trade and do activity basically 24/7, right? Meaning that you have to basically be tokenized in some way to engage in this AI agent agentic world. And if you believe that in the future, most of us, that most of the activity will be through AI agents, then you have to think about what it means to be in their default currency, which is essentially tokens. So the conclusion we're drawing from this is that basically crypto is a natural hedge to AI. Now, which crypto, different topic, but the point is that, they're generating tokens, they're participating in tokens, they're creating value, right? So if you're not tokenized or if you're not able to engage in their language, then you're not going to be able to sort of derive that next level of value from it, right? And it's kind of the same, when we talk about digital literacy back in the day, 20 or 30 years ago, if you weren't going online, if you weren't going onto the internet, then you would become irrelevant today because you just simply don't have a presence, right? And so how do you do this? By going online. And so how do you, as an individual, for most of us, hedge ourselves against an agentic AI future? And we think it is to own basically crypto. So which comes down to some final thoughts around this, which is one, sort of what kind of crypto? And of course, there's all sorts of things you could do. And Bitcoin it's probably the safest investment in the space. And I think for most people who are sort of thinking traditionally, that's the best hedge that you can think of, right? At least for the time being. And you can see how crypto, when you compare altcoins and Bitcoin relative to it, Bitcoin's now more like, I think, closer to 3 trillion. But anyway, you can see basically in relative terms, how small it is still, even despite its large size. And gold now is actually 25 trillion, actually. So it's gone up since we made this slide. But the point is, you can see the relative growth in the sector. But I want to sort of point a bit of the attention where we're focusing on, which is around the altcoin space and why we think that's relevant as an index of essentially the hedge of the space, especially when it comes to AI. Because AI isn't, we think, going to be using Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a store of value. They're going to be using altcoins, whether they are sort of basically, gaming tokens, whether they are meme coins, whatever the AI does, or even generated ones by themselves. They're going to be mostly, we think, trade in the form of these altcoins. And today, users use altcoins. They don't really use Bitcoin in terms of sort of activity, which is again more like gold. When we take parallels about essentially, the market value of gold, which is always the largest asset really in this category. There's no company, even Nvidia at like 4.4 trillion, is not larger than gold today, which is about 27 trillion. But when you take the collection of all of the market caps of the public companies here, not including the private companies, we're at 126 to 128 trillion, meaning that the operational businesses that are listed are actually collectively larger than gold, but no single entity is larger than that. And to us, we think altcoins will function exactly the same way, because where is all the activity? Where is all the growth? Where is all the utility happening basically in the blockchain space? It's happening with altcoins, whether it's Ethereum, Solana, or game tokens, or whatever that may be, right? The point is it's happening in that industry. It's the one driving users, bringing people into the ecosystem. And it's also what AI agents are going to be using, right? So that means that eventually we're so early that altcoins are currently half the size of Bitcoin, which is the digital gold standard. Like you make money in altcoins and then you save it in Bitcoin. But actually what we think will happen is that altcoins will not just flip Bitcoin as a collective, it will be significantly larger in a similar type of ratio as a whole, right? And what we also think is, this is only representative of the public markets. When you add the private markets, you probably have to add another 80 to 100 trillion dollars into that as well, right? So you can kind of see what we think the ratio will be. It kind of makes sense from our perspective because altcoins is where the growth is, and that's basically where AI agents are going to be using most of it, which is the reason why at Animoca Brands, we're such an active investor in the space, particularly in altcoins, in AI, and in gaming, and infra, because we believe essentially those are the toolings that we as users use, but also actually AI agents are going to be using that. And if you as a company aren't thinking about how to tokenize yourself or take leverage of this, then essentially you need to think about essentially how you can sort of hedge yourself against the space by owning, maybe Bitcoin or crypto as we think of that broadly, or altcoins in the space, because that's a way in which we think you can hedge yourself against this kind of AI agentic future. So closing thoughts: how do we deal with this as humans? Because of course we're creative engines, but it's hard from a sort of future where suddenly we're working for AI agents, and the entire world is basically sort of what do we do and how do we sort of partake in this? So when you look at the sort of just global economies, actually GDP increases with financial literacy, and that makes sense. And so you're in Liechtenstein and just around Switzerland, and you guys are very, very financial literate, and you are amongst the wealthiest in the world by per capita, no question, right? You go further out, even around your neighboring countries in relatively wealthy Europe, and you have a very different picture because the financial literacy is much lower, which means also relative GDP per capita is probably also lower, right? And there's a direct correlation between that. And so what we see, and it's not just about, hey, you need to own crypto so you can sort of be hedged against this, right? Actually, there's a problem in the world today, which is that we have the financially literate and the financially illiterate. And all of you here are likely to be somewhere in the top 1% or top percentile because you're financially literate. You are, capitalists, you understand money, which means it's much easier for you to understand crypto. It's much easier for you to get involved in this way. You can't hedge yourself against an AI feature if you don't understand what is the asset class and what is the capitalist construct that AI is going to be using, because you don't know anything about the money. And I think this is the difference here. And as we look at the sort of, we know that the Gini coefficient is getting worse and worse. And this is not just in the US, it's pretty much almost all over the world, right? Middle class is getting sort of, worn out because they're mostly in the labor class. So we have to turn people more financially literate. And the challenge is, of course, that when you think about this recent study that showed about essentially people who graduated, actually more than half of the online world considers themselves lacking financial understanding. There's another shocking statistic that showed that, I think global, of course this includes places like Africa, the people who have a stock portfolio are less than 10%, right? And in a future where information, in the internet, where information was widely distributed, it was fine because information didn't have the same financial construct. I had access to the internet and I had information, I could derive some value from this. But now where everything is financified in the world of tokenization, because you have property rights and therefore capitalism, if you don't understand money, you will be left out of the cycle, not understanding because you don't understand money. And I used to live in Europe, and there's a problem sometimes I see with some people in Europe who don't want to talk about it. It's kind of rude to talk about it, but actually you have to, because that's the world we live in. And most people feel like they're unprepared, right? So we have a really big financial literacy problem. And so I want to draw you on a final story here. You may have heard of Axie Infinity. It's one of our portfolios. This is an older article from last year in the New York Times, but millions and millions of people in the Philippines, most of the old headlines were around, gaming tokens and, but whatever, it didn't work out. Actually, Axie Infinity is doing reasonably well. It's not got the same hype, but in the same way that NFTs don't have the same hype, but, still trading about $500 million a month. And what happens here is that all those people who didn't have a bank account, who are not financially educated, in fact, don't have a university degree, but got introduced to the world of crypto basically through a game because they understood how to trade or how to buy these tokens. And it started with Axie, and then eventually some of them bought Bitcoin or Ethereum or started to diversify because they now understood something about money. They understood something about basically a financial construct. And think about also, how do our children historically learn about money? Not often from the parents, but maybe because of trading cards. Like how many children learn about money because they're trading Pokemon cards or football cards or baseball cards, something where money is involved and they learn about this space, right? But we're so digitally connected that actually the space of digital and money was kind of abstracted away because of the fact that the digital worlds didn't allow us to have real ownership until basically crypto came along. And we see now in the Philippines a real revolution where you basically have people without bank accounts actually in some cases being more financially literate than you have basically in people who might have a bank account, but they never invest because they never had to or they don't understand anything around this. And so which comes down to this thing around sort of hedging ourselves in this future of AI, to my final thoughts, which is that I think the real superpower that we have with crypto and Web3 for us as a species isn't specifically just that, yes, it's tokenization and it's exciting and you can tokenize stuff, but actually what's happening today, in the same way that information basically sort of was so distributed that we used to have this thing called digital literacy, right? For those of you who are old enough to remember, and that's gone. If you're not digital literate, you're not relevant. And now we have to be financially literate or we won't be relevant. And what crypto and Web3 is doing through tokenization, through essentially the blockchain and through this distribution for our children and also for our older people, is that it's actually making the world more financially literate because you're now owning something that you can trade and you can activity and learn about investing in one form or the other. And I think this is important because if you're not financially literate, then you're not going to know how to invest and you're not going to know how to hedge yourself against an agentic AI future, which is so critical because the actual asset class of AI is basically crypto and tokenized assets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yat. And I think there's a warm round of applause here in the room. Very, very insightful. That's a very big picture. Super interesting. We'll look forward to see how that plays out, and I'm sure some of it will play out sooner than others, but we'll be keeping an eye on that. And thank you very much for dialing in, sharing your thoughts. Look forward to seeing more good things from your side in the future. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.